Well, welcome. And this is the third in a series of four sessions on the impact of technological developments upon the life of the church. And I'm painting with a broad brush to talk about how general changes in the culture do have implications for congregational life, even though that might not be immediately evident. And today I'm going to talk about changes in transportation and the mobility of the American population, which isn't new to the 21st century. It's been happening ever since the late 19th century, but its impact upon congregations has been huge and will continue to increase. And just for background, the history of all religions, including Christianity, show that most religions have been rooted in small, cohesive, stable, geographic communities, villages, towns, even neighborhoods in cities. And I want to emphasize stable, long-term, cohesive. Think about this church. Not recently, because now everything's changed, but you're going to be celebrating your 300th anniversary. Imagine 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago. This region around Hershey was populated by Scots-Irish. Anybody here descended from Scotch-Irish ancestors here? One, okay.
Not here, but I'm from Scotch-Irish.
Okay, from Pennsylvania? Okay, that's good. I was about to say that's good, but that is significant. But many are not, and that's typical. But 100 years ago, most 90% would have been. And that meant that they shared a common history, common ancestors, had intermarried, were probably genetically related to one another, shared a common culture, that their ancestors were buried in the church cemetery, that they ate the same kind of food. And that's still the case in isolated communities in the United States, but it's becoming increasingly rare. But the point is that religion was part of a stable, long-term way of life. It wasn't just Sunday mornings, it was every aspect of life was permeated with religion. Or in more extremely, I preached a few years ago at it's called an Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. It's not this denomination, it's a much more conservative and smaller denomination in southern Lancaster County, where they were celebrating their 300th anniversary. But they were a farming community. Most of the folk had kept the family farms, and their families had never left. So they went back generations. They were violently Scots Presbyterian, and actually violently. Their worship service, they told me they didn't do this every Sunday, but once a month, when they were going to have communion, they would, as was the case in Scotland, they would have kilted people, people with plaid kilts, carry in the Bible over their heads. The beadle was the official title of that job, followed by bagpipers, and then come up and put the Bible on the pulpit with bagpipes playing. And I mentioned that part of their history was that they, back in Scotland, had taken a covenant in the 17th century to destroy the monarchy of England. That was part of their church covenant. And then a lay leader sitting in the front row said, "What do you mean we used to?" and then he showed me their order of worship with the covenant in it. And I wanted to warn then Queen Elizabeth, don't visit southern Lancaster County. Or I have a Catholic Irish friend who said, being Catholic, drinking Guinness, and river dance are all part of the same package. You can't have one without the other. So I'm mentioning those because to illustrate how ethnicity, family ties, regionalism, all used to form a package. And that's what religion was all about. One sociologist of religion named Peter Berger says, for most of human history, religions, including Christianity, have been a sacred canopy spread over a local way of life. Religions gave people the impression that our way of life is the way of life that God likes. There's something sacred about it. There's something holy about it. We're part of the rhythms of the universe. This is what the Creator wants. So that religion was woven into the fabric of daily life. I think I may have mentioned that I grew up in this kind of situation in a small town in New Jersey where the Bible was read in public schools before class started. The Sunday school classes marched in civic parades. There was a creche every Christmas on civic property, the town hall. There was a giant star of Bethlehem on a hill illuminated with tax dollars, and then a cross at Easter paid for by tax dollars with no exemptions for religion. So that as long as people stayed there and continued to intermarry, they were all subjected to the same religious influences from every aspect of life. You'd get it from the Boy Scouts, you'd get it from the Girl Scouts, you'd get it in public schools, you'd get it at the Lions Club, you'd get it at the Rotary Club. Religion was part of everything, and every meeting started with prayer, and an overtly Christian prayer. What changed, or what helped change that, was transportation and some other things. Folk, with the advent of steamships, trains, then cars, didn't have to stay where they were born. And some other social phenomenon accelerated the tendency to move. And when you move to a new locale, you don't know anybody. You're not related to anybody. There might not be a church of your denomination around. You might marry or have friends from a different denomination. So the religious instruction and inputs that you had become used to as you were growing up are changed, or maybe even entirely gone. And that tends to weaken religious allegiance. It tends to weaken loyalty. If I had stayed in the town that I had grown up in, which was predominantly Baptist, and all my relatives were Baptist, and everybody I knew pretty much was Baptist, I'm sure I would have stayed Baptist. But I moved. I went to college outside that region and met a ton of other people from different religious backgrounds. And my loyalty to being Baptist eroded and atrophied, and eventually disappeared where I changed denominations. And that has become increasingly common. So geographic mobility has done away with that village world where everybody grows up in the town they were born in, and their children will grow up in it, and their grandchildren will grow up in it. And actually, most religions were based on that assumption that that if you baptize a child, do early education with a child, that child will stay in that congregation, and you can program how they will mature. But those days are gone. And this isn't, the changes in geographic mobility is not something new to Christianity. It's happened before, but in more subtle and less extreme ways. It started even right after the time of Jesus. The Apostle Paul Christianity spread in the Mediterranean because the Mediterranean was then a Roman lake. It had not been. It had been controlled by various empires and pirates. But when the Romans took control of the whole thing, then shipping became very common and easy. And so the Apostle Paul was able to travel around the Mediterranean from Corinth to Philippi to Rome without any problem. And so did other Christians, particularly merchants. And that meant that if you were living in Corinth and you had been worshiping Zeus, suddenly Christians come. Christian merchants, maybe even Christian apostles. And you're exposed to a new religion and a new way of looking at things. And it wasn't just Christians who were spreading new religions. There was a lot of mystery religions in the Roman Empire, worshipers of gods like Mithras and Osiris. And that weakened the attachment of Romans to their traditional gods, Jupiter, Hera, Juno, Apollo. And Christianity wouldn't have spread if that had not been possible, if that kind of mobility through the shipping lanes had not been possible. It also enabled Christianity to not remain a sect of Judaism. If Christians had just stayed in Palestine and not spread throughout the Mediterranean world, then Gentile Christianity would not have flourished, and Christianity would still be a subdivision of Judaism. The other big change was, of course, the age of exploration, starting in the late 15th century and then accelerating through the 19th and 20th, where changes in transportation, particularly steamships, enabled folk to actually go to other cultures, have business dealings with other cultures, and discover that some of the people they were dealing with weren't all that bad. In the Middle Ages, it was just assumed that all Muslims are evil. It was partly because no one had ever met one, or at least the only ones they had met were through crusades and they were trying to kill them. But by having contact with people in other parts of the world, it raised questions about, does God hate these other people? Is God going to send all Muslims, even if they seem to be decent, to hell? Does God hate all Hindus? And that raised questions about the exclusive validity of Christianity. And people began to think, well, maybe Christianity is just one good religion among others. And maybe there are good Christians, but there are also good Muslims. So that raised some questions about, is Christianity the only way to salvation? And now that's accelerated with folk of different religions, not just living in other countries, but being present in your neighborhood. And that's all part of that's the fruit of the revolution in transportation. But even then, in the 19th century, most people with trains and steamships, most people still didn't travel. They stayed where they were, pretty much. Merchants did, soldiers did. But with the advent of cars in the 20th century, and then Eisenhower's interstate network, everybody began to travel. Going to Florida became a thing. Going to the West Coast. People were moving all over the place for amusement, and even more importantly, for work. Because the other thing that had happened was industrialization and technologization. So, to use one example, in World War I and then more so in World War II, men would go, and sometimes women would go away to war, learn a trade, like how to fix an army tank. And then the war's over, they come back, they discover that they have a skill, and that skill is transferable to tractors. Which means, however, you gotta move to where there's a tractor factory. So after World War I and more so World War II, a great deal of geographic dislocation in the United States. folk who had acquired specialized skills that were needed, but in certain parts of the country where the relevant factory was. So people couldn't go home so much to where they had come from. They had to go to where their skill was needed and would be remunerated. So that led to a huge amount of geographic dislocation, which also meant that folk were moving to areas where they had no relatives, they didn't know anybody, and consequently, the church was not as big a part of their lives as it had been. So in the villages, social life revolved around the church. Maybe some of you can remember those days where, you didn't go to restaurants, you went to the church pancake breakfast. And you went to the church spaghetti dinner. And you even, in high school, you'd go to the church dance. And you'd play on a church sports team. So that the church was at the center of everything. But with mobility and people moving around where they didn't know anybody and not knowing what congregation to join, that eventually eroded. And what eroded even more so was you didn't have to live near the church you attended because you had a car. You could live in a suburb and you didn't have to walk to church. You could drive 10, 20 miles to a congregation of your choice. How many folk live within walking distance of here? Yeah. So I would conclude from that is this is not a neighborhood church. But all churches had been that, and programming of worship and education had that in mind, that the congregation is going to be the center of social life, and folk are going to come here all the time. How many of you folk come here, let's say, or came here before COVID, more than once a week for Sunday worship? Okay, that? Okay, forget I said that. That's, you've disproven everything I was about to say. But I'm guessing that you folk are sort of in leadership and maybe more committed than many others. This is this is sort of natural selection. How many come here more than twice a week? Okay, we lost a lot there. Now we're down to 2. But it had been the case in the village church that some folk went every day. Every evening there was something going on, maybe a basketball game. But the church was the only show in town, and it was close, and you could walk to it. And it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. And now that's all gone, and it's even more gone because of the internet, and COVID really accelerated it, where it's not even the case that you have to live within driving distance of your congregation. You can be in a different state and Zoom in. And I was told that you're getting some folk from Texas, and that also leads to the phenomenon that if you move out of Hershey, you could still be a member of this congregation. You could Zoom in, but you wouldn't know your geographic neighbors. They wouldn't be part of the picture. So that religion gets more and more compartmentalized as, well, that's something I do on Zoom during certain hours of the week, but during the week, I'm not going to see anybody from the congregation. The other thing that transformations in communications did was promote anonymity. If you grew up in a small town and you didn't have a car, you can't think before cars. I can't think before cars. You were under surveillance by your neighbors all the time, and the folk from your congregation who lived around you. So that if you did anything that was regarded as immoral, sinful, aberrant, strange, you were going to be reported. It would be detected, and your parents would hear about it from their neighbors. But with cars, you could drive to a neighboring town where nobody knew who you were. And you could act out any way you wanted, and engage in behaviors that you would never have thought of if you were limited to your town. I used to teach in Richmond, Virginia, and at a Presbyterian school. And when I moved there, I asked the president, because I wasn't quite sure what the culture was like. I said, what's the policy consuming alcoholic beverages? And he said, oh, no, we're liberal Presbyterians. It's the Baptists and the Methodists who are teetotalers, but we're fine with that. He said, just don't do it in this county. So I said, okay, alcoholic beverages are okay, but I can't be seen in public around here. I have to go somewhere where nobody knows who I am, and I won't embarrass the school. I said, yeah, that's right. Without cars, that would have been impossible. But since I had a car, I could drive outside Richmond and do anything I wanted with impunity. So cars tended to weaken the sense of church morality, that there are certain behaviors that good church people engage in and certain behaviors that they don't engage in. And that was enforced because neighbors would see what you were doing. And the word would get all over town. But not so now. So mobility and changes in transportation and the ease of transportation have tended to undermine a sense of a corporate morality that everybody must adhere to and make moral choices much more common. Because what I'm building up to is that because of changes in transportation and everybody moving around, oh, and by the way, the average American lives in 5 different places, significantly different places. Not like they moved from Harrisburg to Hershey, but in different parts of the country. The average American is 5 times a move in their lifetime. So that's a pretty high degree of mobility. And given the fact that there are still lots of folk who were born in South Central Pennsylvania and never left it, that means there's, to balance them out and get the average to 5, there's a lot of people moving around a lot more than 5 times. Just think about your own life and how many times you made a significant geographic move. How many have never done it? You were born here, you're still here.
Well, I was born in Harrisburg, but I moved to Hershey, so.
Well, that's close.
Geographically, it's the same area.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe it's a different culture, but probably not. How many have moved only twice?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, just one. How many have moved 4 times?
Yeah.
Does the Army count?
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. The Army and the specialization of skills are probably more responsible for this than anything else. Yeah. Okay, so you're actually right on the money, I think. A lot of folk are moving around a lot. 1 or 2 people, not so much. So, and because of that, one of the implications for the church is that allegiance to any particular congregation or denomination began to dissipate. You move into a new town, most folk, and this is statistically proven, let's say you've been raised Presbyterian. You move from Derry to California. Most folk would not say to themselves, the most important thing I have to do is find a Presbyterian church. They might say to themselves, I need to find a church, but denominational factors would not be primary. It might be, do they have a nice community? Is the music good? Do they have child education program? Do they have some activities that I would enjoy? Is the worship lively and uplifting? So that means that for most folk, attachment to Presbyterianism is diminished. And when you move, that might not be a primary factor. And if you have children, they might end up being raised in the educational systems of several different, Sunday schools of several different denominations, and get kind of religiously mixed message. And to put it simply, a lot of folk have intense attachment to a congregation or a denomination because of their childhood memories. They've never left town, they've never moved, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents went to that church, they're buried in the cemetery, there are plaques to them on the walls, there's maybe a stained glass commemorating them, they're on the lists of church leaders that are posted somewhere in the church. And so, of course, and people have memories of the way the sanctuary smelled, or the pictures that were on the wall, or the kinds of food that were served at covered dish dinners. And all those childhood memories give them a sense of security. It's a warm, fuzzy feeling. But if you move around a lot as a child, then you don't have those memories. And you move to a different part of the country, and at the church dinner, you don't get the smell of the Penn Central chicken pot pie, which really has no crust, and it's not pie at all, and it just has noodles.
Egg noodles.
Yeah, or chicken and waffles, which, being from New Jersey, I think is an abomination.
You're right.
But if you grew up with that, and you associate that with church dinners, then you're going to want that. But you move away from Pennsylvania, no chicken and waffles, no slippery chicken pie, and the smells are different, the sights are different, the stained glass windows are different, and you don't have that childhood nostalgia to keep you rooted. So there's actually a pretty strict correlation between people who move around a lot and people who eventually leave the church entirely. So there's no that sense of, this is part of my identity, and this is part of the identity of my family. And if I don't go here, I'm going to forget who I am. That's disappearing, which means that churches cannot assume that loyalty to a denomination or to Christianity in general will be sufficient to keep people in church. It used to be that way, that if your whole identity of yourself, your ancestors, everybody you knew was attached to a local congregation, you'd stay there. You'd be loyal to it. You'd be loyal to it even if you didn't like the pastor. Even if you hated the pastor, you'd still go because that was your family church. Now that's gone. So congregations now have to persuade people to come. They used to come out of loyalty. Now they don't. Now you have to it's like a business now. You have to make a case statement. You have to advertise. And you have to have an elevator speech for your product. And you have to be able to show how you're different from competitors. So now it's a culture of persuasion rather than a culture of loyalty.
You have to have a good website.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Did I mention my website adventure with the congregation? Okay, I don't know why they did it, but a church that shall remain nameless in northeastern Pennsylvania in the old coal country was declining in membership. And they knew they were going to become extinct if that trajectory continued. So they called me in to, I don't know why, to be an advisor. So I went up there, spent some time with them, looked at the life of their congregation. I said, well, there's some things that you're not doing that you really should be doing. Number one, there's no signage on the street. nobody knows you're here. You're not in the phone book. And you don't have a website. So I did mention you don't have a website. So the pastor said, well, yeah, there's a kid in the congregation who I think knows about websites, and he can help us set one up. So that happened, and a month later, they called me back, and the pastor said, well, yeah, we have a website now, and it's great, because we have figured out how to block it from people who are not members.
Oh.
So I said, no, wait a minute. I thought you wanted growth and you wanted new people. He said, well, yeah, but we don't want people where we don't know their families.
Oh, wow.
And so I said, wait, okay, you want new people, but people who are just like you. We said, that's right. We want to know their families, we want to know their background.
Wow.
So, well, since you're in a geographic area of pretty extreme population decline, good luck with that. But yeah, so advertising, websites are important, and most congregations aren't used to that, especially in the Protestant mainline. I think Derry is way ahead of the curve, because Derry, I think, is a congregation that got used to mobility very quickly. Had to, because of people coming and going from the medical center and other industries around, and figured this out, that you've got to advertise, you've got to have something that's attractive for people to come. You can't rely on loyalty. You can't assume that if a Presbyterian, somebody who's raised Presbyterian, moves into Hershey, that they're immediately going to come here. You've got to give them you've got to persuade them. You've got to give them a reason to come, and that requires advertising, and even what used to be called evangelism, outreach, which mainline Protestant churches are usually terrible at, because they didn't have to do it. They used to rely just on loyalty. Another implication of this is that the notion that used to govern most congregations, that folk would stay in it for a long period of time, maybe for their entire lifespan, and that education and even worship could build upon things that people had learned in prior years. That's pretty much gone. You can't assume that what someone learns in early childhood Sunday school will get continued in a youth group or in a young adult class, or that there will even be much continuity in what they learn in worship, because people don't stay for that long in a congregation. So that makes programming much more difficult in two ways. It's got to be more episodic. Like you can't decide, well, we're going to study the history of the Reformed tradition as it has informed Derry Presbyterian for 3 years. A lot of people are not going to be here for 3 years. It also means that new members' education is much more important, because you probably get folk who were raised Methodist, Catholic, or nothing at all, and they don't know beans about the heritage of this congregation or Presbyterianism in general, and they may not want to. So congregations have a choice. Because of people moving in and out and new people coming in from different traditions, either you can say, well, we're going to beef up the new member stuff so that they will become familiar with what's unique about Presbyterianism, what's unique about Derry congregation, or you could go the opposite direction and say we're going to deliberately become more generic and focus on those things that most Christians have in common. And we're not even going to promote anything that's distinctive about Presbyterianism. But even there, you still have to do a lot of education. I hope nobody from my seminary ever sees this. I'm struck by even students we get show very little familiarity with even like the childhood Bible stories. So they'll say things like, I've heard of David and Goliath. Now, which one won? Who came first, Moses or David or Jesus? So the amount of biblical ignorance is colossal. And it's partly due to folk not growing up in long-term, stable geographic areas where they went to a church regularly, and it was the same church, and they absorbed things. So even adult education, which Derry is, I think, great at, but most churches are not. Most churches ignore it, to the detriment of the congregation, because a lot of folk don't have much of a clue as to what Christianity is all about. So far the implications of this for the church are, you need to persuade people to come. You can't rely on loyalty. You gotta have a case statement. You gotta advertise. And then the second one is, there's gotta be more attention to new members, and how do you deal with the spiritual needs of folk who are maybe gonna be here for a year or 2 or 3 years and then move on. And the last one I'll say is, the last point about mobility is that it has led to cultural polarization, including polarization within Christianity and polarization within the churches. Because a lot of people are mobile. A lot of people move around a lot because they have skills, and they have to go to where their skills are needed and will be financially rewarded. And that means usually some technological skills, some skills that require college education, and skills that put people in touch with people from other countries. Business contacts, educational contacts, financial contacts, military contacts. To put it simply, some folk, maybe, I don't know, seems to me like half the Christian population in the United States participates in the phenomenon called globalization, where your identity is not local, but your identity is transnational, where you have friends and business contacts in Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, Central America, Africa. And you think globally, and you like it. You enjoy having folk from cultures that are very different from your own. And you're accustomed to it, so that when a Muslim family moves next door, you don't freak out. In fact, you might like it and say, oh, there's going to be some interesting food available. I hope I get invited over for dinner. That's over against, there are still folk who are not mobile, who are still living in the town in which they and their ancestors were born and grew up. Often they're manual workers, unskilled labor, and farmers. And they think about the world very differently. They think about it in terms of what's good for my region, and how can I protect the way of life that I have always known and that my ancestors have known. How can we, to oversimplify it, how can we leave it to beaver time in the 1950s? So they want stasis, are suspicious of change, suspicious of people who are from other cultures, whereas the more globalized population loves that diversity, loves that pluralism, loves that experimentation. And that has led to a profound cultural conflict in the United States. The folk who are geographically mobile and are actually becoming global, and the folk who are not. And the internet has exacerbated that. folk had initially thought that the internet would make everybody kind of global, that everybody would have Facebook partners in other countries. But it turns out it's been the opposite, that the internet has made it possible to communicate with people who are just like you, and silo yourself. So the culture has gotten more polarized. I'm not telling you anything new. And that's partly the regional people versus the globalized people. And congregations are going to have to deal with that, because that's a profound split. And some congregations are taking sides, like we want to restore the neighborhood church, and we want to keep everything the same. We have nostalgia for the 1940s and 50s. And other folk who say, and other congregations say, no, we're going to embrace the change. We're going to embrace cultural pluralism. We're going to sing hymns from other countries in languages that are not our own. And instead of chicken pot pie for the covered dish dinner, we're going to bring in some chicken tikka masala. I'm just having a flashback. In my seminary, we had for a while, somebody was running the cafeteria who decided that the wise thing to do in a situation where some people like the regional food and some people want globalized food was to merge them. So there's like slippery noodles, marsala. And the worst was pancakes with curry sauce. But anyway, this polarization means that many congregations, or at least denominations, will have to have a lot more attention to conflict resolution, because the polarization is not going away. And it's partly the people who travel a lot and the people who don't. The folk who, and that's actually the degree to which someone is quote unquote politically conservative pretty tightly correlates to how rooted are they in a region. You know, are they still living in the place where they were born, and did their ancestors grow up there? So that makes the Dakotas, for example, and Iowa, Midwest, pretty culturally conservative. But where people are highly mobile, the East Coast, the West Coast, then you get much more prevalence of globalized attitudes, which usually goes along with toleration, diversity, pluralism. And that's going to continue. And the church has got to do something about it, or else there will be two rival kinds of Christianity. The big rivalry used to be Protestants versus Catholics. And then in the 60s, it sort of became conservatives versus liberals. But now it's almost, it's morphed a little into, it's like rural regions versus urban and suburban regions. And they still are in the same denominations and meet at national meetings, and in some churches, the same kinds of people are in the congregation. One faction would want American flags in the sanctuary, and the other faction would find that to be anathema. And there's usually a middle-of-the-road faction that would say, well, the flag's okay in the narthex, but maybe not by the pulpit. Or if it has to be by the pulpit, make sure the Bible is more prominent. So those tensions will have to be addressed, and my fear is that in many denominations, they're really not. That the different folk from different cultures are not just call progressive culture versus conservative culture. They're not encouraged to talk to one another. And there usually are not vehicles set up by which they can exchange views and understand each other. That's going to be a challenge for the church of the future. And mobility has a great deal to do with it. So to conclude all this, cars, planes, and now the internet have drastically changed the way we think about church and the way church functions. The neighborhood church, the village church, is still there in some rural parts of the country, but for most of the country, that's gone. But the way our congregations and denominations have evolved is that we assumed that there would be a neighborhood, that there would be a village. And now there isn't, and I think we're still trying to imagine what could a church be like that knows that many people will just be there for a very short time and then they'll move on. Well, I hope I haven't been too depressing, because I don't think it is a cause for panic or anxiety. It's just that the world's changing and the church has to somehow figure out a way to adapt to that. Now I'd like to just entertain questions, ridicule. Yeah.
Given everything you've said about mobility, what's the future of church summer camps?
Oh, real bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're one of the casualties of mobility. Because summer camps used to thrive on the notion that parents had gone to the camps. You know, in some cases even grandparents. It was part of the family tradition. And when you move into a new neighborhood, you don't know anything about the summer camp, maybe don't know anybody who ever sent their kids to it. So summer camps are universally in the United States in trouble. And it does have a lot to do with the folk that most people haven't grown up in the culture that supported the camp, where all their relatives went to the camp. You know, there's a major camp in North Carolina, Presbyterian camp, Montreat. I don't know if any of you have ever been there or heard of it. But a sociologist a few years ago did a study of the youth conference at Montreat and its power. And what they noticed was many of the youth committed themselves to Christianity at the retreat during the summer, that many had received a call to ministry at the retreat in the summer, and many had had their first sexual experience in the summer at the camp. And that all those things blended together. So you associate call to ministry, conversion to Christianity, romance, friendship with the summer camp. For an adolescent, that's a powerful package. But that's going down the tubes as fewer and fewer parents have ever been to Montreat. Or some of the ones who had gone to Montreat might convert to Methodism, move to another part of the country, don't have access to North Carolina, or become nothing. So summer camps in trouble.
Speaking to the camping side of things, one of the marketing side of things is that where you do see growth in camping are the specialty camps for one sport or another sport, or adventure camps or whatever.
Right.
So the camps that can succeed are the ones that adapt to the marketing push, which is to bring in those skills that the society is driving and tie them back into the faith and as the other aspect of it, so that you're kind of serving the parent and the child at the same time.
Right, which means they're also good at marketing.
Yeah.
That we're not just a generic camp where you just come because that's the thing to do, and that's what people around you have always done. This is a Christian soccer camp.
Right.
Where you can learn soccer skills. And that makes us different from other camps.
I grew up in part, I attended both an urban church where I was confirmed, but that I also attended a rural church, a union church, interestingly. And I remember that it was greatly demeaned in that congregation Catholics, the Catholic faith. And when I was dating a Catholic girl in high school, you know, I got a letter from my grandfather explaining why this was the wrong thing to do, and it was something that was going against all the sacrifices that our ancestors had made to come to this country for religious freedom, and that the Catholics were the cause of that relocation and so forth. But it seems now that, you know, we don't feel that way anymore, obviously. Catholic Church has changed in its dogma to some extent. But is that also a function of transportation?
Yeah, and this will be and mobility, the ability to pick up and move to a new location. I grew up in a town, I think I mentioned it, but it had been, ever since the 17th century, solidly Baptist. And then, because we were on a train route to New York, easy access, and then a highway was put into New York and people had cars. During, I don't mean to demean my Italian friends, but during Prohibition, Italian Catholic families moved in, bootlegging. It was an industry. My town was on the coast. It was easy to land booze behind sandbars and little coves, so there were economic opportunities, so that for the first time, Catholics were present, Italian Catholics. And like you, when I was in school, my grandmother warned me, don't play with the Catholic kids, that they're all in the mafia. You know, you might get killed. So, you know, there was a strong prohibition against that kind of mixing. But with the ease of travel and changes in the economy where people would move to different regions in order to market their skills, all that changed. And along with that, intermarriage became a thing. Folk marrying people outside their tradition. There are still denominations that really actively discourage that. Mennonites do. I mean, they basically tell their children, you gotta marry a Mennonite. And if you don't, you will not be particularly welcome at family gatherings. But that's rare. And of course, as folk intermarry, again, allegiance to a particular tradition begins to dissipate. And sometimes even attachment to any church at all dissipates. So, you know, like a Lutheran married to a Catholic say, well, we can't agree on which church to go to, so let's stay home.
Go to Presbyterian church.
Yeah. Yeah.
In principle, the internet should help. In the sense as more jobs become able to be done from wherever you live. I mean, I think COVID kind of helped in that way. You find somewhere where you enjoyed living in the lifestyle of that region, but yet you could maintain your job elsewhere. So I think there's a possibility of more stability to a community.
I think that's probably true. That as more folk can work from home, there's less need to move to a part of the country where your skills are demanded, because you can operate your skills online. So that might lead to more regional stability and less moving around. It also makes it possible that your religious choices are not limited geographically. Like if you move somewhere, you can still zoom in on Sunday mornings to Derry Presbyterian. which means that many congregations are, with online presence, are competing nationally now. It's not just, what's the church that's most attractive to me in the Hershey-Harrisburg region? You can find a congregation anywhere in the country. So that also creates a new world where you have to be more careful with and intentional about branding. Okay. Here's what's good about us.
Don't you think the internet is making it a lot easier to go to church? I mean, and in that, I feel it's much more difficult for all of us to get up and get dressed and come together, but I think it's more important. I think to be able
Yeah.
to sit there and sip coffee and be part of it is, I don't know, I don't feel good about that.
Yeah, you know, I'm with you there, and I think there are still a lot of people who, and some sociologists have documented this, as folk work more and more online, and therefore see other human beings face to face less,
Right.
we're basically herd animals, and we want to see other people. And so those instincts of, I want to be in community with somebody, and I just don't want to watch them on a screen, kick in. So that might actually help physical attendance at churches, as people are feeling like socially deprived. I haven't had face-to-face contact with anybody except the checkout person at the grocery store, but even they're being replaced by self-checkout.
Yeah.
Only if you use them.
Yeah.
Don't use them, because if you use them, you get rid of that person.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly,
You're killing a job.
exactly.
So I don't use them.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't
And
either.
I go to the same grocery store all the time, and I know the checkout people, and I enjoy chatting with them for 5 seconds. So that desire to just have human contact might make face-to-face congregational life more attractive.
But I've been reading this tendency of companies to keep people at home and working remote. Depending on what you do, that's working. But for the most part, the companies are finding over a long haul, it's not working.
Yes.
Because they're missing that camaraderie, that focus, getting together, trying new ideas on a face-to-face basis, and they're demanding people to come back into work several days a week just to counter that. And I think the jury is out as to what's going to really ultimately happen. But there's another sentiment coming, and that's a shorter work week.
Yeah.
A lot of companies are expanding, trying this 4-day work week, and they're finding that overall, they're being more efficient, they're getting more work done in less time than they were when they stretched it out over a 40 or 60-hour work week. And
Right.
that's gonna make a big difference, because if everybody suddenly gets a 3 or 4 day weekend, who knows where they're gonna be?
Yeah, I think that's right. Corporations are discovering that, particularly in areas like research and design, where folk work in a team, that there's less team loyalty if you actually don't interact with the folk
Right.
daily in a physical way. If you just see them as a little tile on your computer screen, you don't have the sense of responsibility to them and concern for them. It's not just me, it's my whole team that's at stake here. That gets diminished.
I'm thinking Bill may want to go back to work with a 4-day work week.
Hey, who knows?
Yeah. And even that will have ramifications for congregational life.
Yeah.
Good place, yeah.
Then you've got 3 days in which people are not working. Could they come back to church functions?
I remember 20 or 25 years ago, when we did our strategic plan here, back before, or around the time Dick got here, I guess Dick helped. Two of the things that I recall were important for a church to grow were a great music program, and of course a very top-notch organ you wanted to have, right? And 2, relational groups.
Mm-hmm.
Relational groups for all kinds of, people, divorced people, single people, what have you. And I'm wondering whether you know any churches that have translated the relational group piece into an online presence for those groups.
Yeah, and that has happened with varying degrees of success. Online, well, where they had been successful was where the folk already knew each other. And then the group became more virtual. And maybe even folk at a geographic distance. Where they don't seem to work is if the folk never actually physically met. Because then the trust, the ability to read body language, the familiarity is just not there. It's, and we're going to talk about this a little next time. The other thing is that virtual groups are, many people are rightly distrustful of them, because if you don't actually know the person and see them in a daily or weekly context, they can invent an identity that is illusory. You can do that by inventing online persona, and even if you're just online as yourself, you can still act in a way that's not the way you typically act, and say things about yourself which are exaggerations or not true. You know, I've even been told that some politicians do that. Yeah.
Well, you know, you just brought up something that was so close to my heart, and I never expressed it. There are a few people in this room. We're all in the same committee on church, and I really, when the virtual meeting went on, you know, the first 2 or 3 were okay, but I really, and I never got to vocalize. I was getting ready to vocalize. I vocalized to another person on the committee offline, but I was feeling aloof. I was feeling like I really didn't know the people I was working with anymore. I didn't feel that we really had a voice. I felt like we were going quickly, but I really didn't feel like we had a voice of friendship.